We didn't welcome Yoko in the studio. John's in love with this girl. If he wants to bring her in the studio, we've got to cope with that.
When the Beatles called it quits in 1970, it sent shockwaves through the entire music world. Once the kings of the 60s sound, their legacy was unmatched. But as the decade ended, their harmony crumbled. Whispers had been flying for years about what truly led to their collapse, and fans were desperate for clarity. Over time, Paul McCartney didn't hold back about his disappointments, especially when it came to John Lennon's wife, Yoko Ono, stepping into the studio. She became an easy target, taking much of the blame in public narratives and fan theories. Yet in more recent years, McCartney's insights have added new layers to the story, suggesting it wasn't so black and white. Let's unravel the deeper story behind the Beatles' split and how McCartney's opinion on Yoko and the breakup itself has shifted. From over half a century of interviews, we've pieced together the real tension between McCartney and Lennon during those final days. It's no secret that Ono's presence during studio sessions stirred up discomfort between the band's core creatives. During the making of the White Album, she wasn't just nearby, she was right there in the thick of things. While none of the band members spoke out openly, there was clearly some silent hesitation about her constant presence. McCartney, in particular, hinted that she disrupted their rhythm, quietly fanning the flames of tension. Imagine the pressure of trying to record history-making music while navigating unspoken resentment in the room. Lennon's firm decision to involve Ono wasn't just about love. It marked a turning point in his focus. Far from just observing, Yoko was heavily engaged in Lennon's artistic decisions, changing the group's creative flow. It's no wonder McCartney and others might have felt pushed aside, deepening the cracks in their bond. The strain didn't explode publicly, but behind closed doors, it made everything more difficult than it had to be. McCartney later admitted they bit their tongues. Not to keep peace, but to keep the work moving forward. They weren't trying to save friendships at that point, they were just trying to finish the job, plain and simple. And that revelation came during one of McCartney's recent podcast episodes, where he looked back with more clarity than ever. In McCartney's Life and Lyrics, the legendary bassist offered fresh insight into Yoko Ono's involvement with the Beatles. Rather than ignoring her presence, he acknowledged how her closeness to Lennon naturally influenced the group dynamic. Her physical presence during recording sessions, sitting right between bandmates, became something they all had to adapt to. Still, McCartney emphasized that if Lennon insisted on this arrangement, then they had no valid reason to object. It didn't make things easier, especially since Lennon ultimately took the first step in walking away from the band. Though this fact came to light much later, it was McCartney who initially bore the public's blame for the group's collapse. This added a layer of frustration for him, compounding the emotional toll of the band's unraveling. But the tale took a twist over the years, with McCartney eventually softening his stance on Ono. In a candid conversation years down the line, he confessed that painting her as the villain was a gross oversimplification. He further explained that tensions within the Beatles had existed long before Yoko entered the picture. By saying this, he helped shift the narrative away from Yoko as the scapegoat. And in doing so, McCartney seemed to silence much of the speculation surrounding his rumored resentment toward Lennon's wife. To say she was the single force that broke up the Beatles was, as he put it, both unfair and inaccurate. This acknowledgement helped ease decades of misplaced anger from devoted fans who had long viewed her as the enemy. Yoko herself once likened the fans' hate to being falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit. Finally, being released from that emotional burden must have felt like redemption for her. McCartney even expressed admiration for the pair, describing them as a strong and inspiring unit. He concluded that the Beatles' breakup stemmed from a tangled web of issues, not just one woman's presence. So if Yoko wasn't the sole cause, what then drove this iconic band apart? There were many layers at play: personal evolution, clashing visions, and the natural drifting of creative minds. To reduce it all to one relationship would be to miss the bigger, more complicated picture. As the 1960s drew to a close, creative tensions had already begun to reshape the inner workings of the Beatles. While John Lennon found himself drawn to avant-garde art and experimental music, deeply shaped by his relationship with Yoko Ono, Paul McCartney, in contrast, was embracing the charm of traditional pop styles. That artistic divergence only widened the emotional distance between the two longtime collaborators who had once shared everything musically. Given this widening gap, it seemed almost inevitable that someone new, particularly Ono, would be viewed as the catalyst for their division. Such growing independence among members made their collaborative dynamic increasingly fragile and may have accelerated their eventual disbandment. In hindsight, McCartney would admit that trying to fuse four strong-willed individuals into one group was like mixing oil and water. It could only last so long. Another piece of the puzzle was the overwhelming and rapid rise to global fame, which thrust enormous pressure on the band from nearly every direction. By the tail end of the decade, the Beatles had ceased performing live, opting instead to devote all their focus to the recording studio. This studio-only approach birthed masterpieces, no doubt, but also revealed rifts in their personal and professional connections. The absence of touring and the constant grind in the studio eventually led to frustration and fatigue among the members. Adding to this mix of turmoil was a significant change in leadership after their longtime manager, Brian Epstein, passed away in 1967. McCartney, in particular, grew increasingly disillusioned with the man who stepped into Epstein's shoes, Alan Klein. From McCartney's perspective, Klein's influence over the band's business affairs was deeply unwelcome and sparked lasting resentment. In fact, Paul made it clear he was ready to fight back, ultimately launching legal action to cut Klein off from managing the band's finances. After all the internal battles and courtroom drama, McCartney sought solitude and retreated to his farm in Scotland. But even in that peaceful environment, the pain didn't lift. Instead, the silence gave way to depression and a deep identity crisis. The collapse of the Beatles, paired with legal warfare, left McCartney questioning not only his future career, but also whether he still belonged in the world of music at all. In several candid reflections, he opened up about relying heavily on alcohol as he grappled with a lack of direction and daily purpose, often drifting through life in confusion. But everything began to shift when his wife Linda stepped in, motivating him to return to his roots in music, reigniting his creative spirit. That difficult chapter in his journey, though filled with emotional trials, served as the launching pad for his solo ventures and the eventual birth of Wings. Yet, despite all the milestones he hit after the Beatles, McCartney found himself frequently haunted by their legacy, unable to fully escape its long-lasting echo. Over time, he spoke openly in interviews, coming to terms with the past and releasing any lingering resentment he once held toward Ono. Considering the tension and evolving relationships within the band, it's fair to say their breakup became more a question of when than if. With hindsight, McCartney came to appreciate the complexity of their situation, even if that period remained one of his deepest personal challenges. Ultimately, he realized that Ono had been unfairly scapegoated in the Beatles' breakup saga, reframing the narrative that had long painted her as the antagonist. The dissolution of the Beatles didn't hinge on a single dramatic event, but rather emerged from an accumulation of internal shifts, changes, and growing pains. One of the clearest indicators of trouble was the breakdown of the creative synergy that had once defined their songwriting magic. As the years wore on, the once seamless Lennon-McCartney partnership began to splinter, driven by diverging musical ambitions and evolving perspectives. Paul longed to maintain the band's polished identity, preferring refined production and pop sensibilities, contrasting sharply with John's experimental instincts. Inspired heavily by his personal life and Yoko Ono's artistic influence, Lennon embraced more raw, unconventional musical styles that clashed with Paul's approach. What used to be a balanced exchange of ideas slowly turned into a tug-of-war, where each tried to steer the band toward his own vision. George Harrison, too, wasn't immune to frustration, as he struggled to find equal footing in a group dominated by two giants. By the late 60s, his songwriting had blossomed, and he believed his musical ideas deserved recognition equal to his bandmates. Despite composing iconic songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, Harrison frequently felt his contributions were overlooked in creative discussions. The tension escalated to the point where Harrison actually walked out during a session, a moment that underscored how fractured things had become. But perhaps the most emotionally charged factor was Lennon's deepening relationship with Yoko Ono, which added an entirely new dimension to the band dynamic. Though many pointed fingers at Ono, the full picture reveals a web of complexities far beyond a single person's influence. Their emotional and creative connection became central to Lennon's life, embedding her presence in nearly every part of his world. Inside the studio, her constant presence was a new dynamic, something the other Beatles weren't used to. It wasn't necessarily Ono as a person that stirred things up, but rather what she symbolized. Lennon's increasing push for individuality. John was clearly stepping toward a new chapter, one where his music and life no longer revolved around being a Beatle. And with that shift in loyalty came cracks in the unity that once made the Beatles unstoppable. Between the relentless spotlight, their unmatched legacy, and the evolving circumstances in each member's personal life, their split began to feel inevitable. Reflecting on it all, it becomes more obvious that the group had simply reached its natural limit. They were no longer moving in the same direction. Each one had grown in different ways, chasing different goals and artistic visions. Though fans across the world found the breakup heartbreaking, for the four Beatles, it was the only way to grow beyond their shared history. As McCartney would one day admit, parting ways with the band hurt deeply, but that very ending gave birth to new beginnings for them all. Without the weight of being part of the greatest band ever, they were free to carve out identities of their own. Now turning to McCartney's take on Yoko Ono, what's your perspective? Given all these layers, where do you think the real fault line in the Beatles' split lies? Do you personally think Ono had a meaningful influence on their breakup? And looking back, was the criticism and blame aimed at her fair or way off base? We're genuinely curious to hear your opinion, so drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.